Can we look at the US now and a meeting that happened overnight when the US Secretary of Defense sort of called in all the top military brass? There was talk of Trump gathering the generals, if you like. Do we know what all that was about? Did it happen?
It did happen, yes. So Hegseth recalled something like 800 top military leaders back to Quantico and gave this kind of like TED Talk style speech to them, in which he said some pretty outrageous things about, that they'd become the Department of Woke and that there would be no more dudes in dresses and a series of other kind of gross and outrageous things. And he was followed up by an hour-long campaign-style speech by President Trump, which was unlike a lot of those campaign-style speeches because, of course, he was faced with a somewhat stony-faced audience of mostly men in uniform who were trained, not to react and not to engage in that kind of politics. And I guess, Glenn, it was one of those, we'll talk about this a little bit, the way that Trump is kind of hard to grapple with because he's simultaneously so ridiculous and so dangerous. And this was one of those situations, I think, where a lot of the coverage has ridiculed this as this meeting could have been an email kind of situation. Why do you call back 800 leaders from across the world to give a TED Talk? Like, why is that necessary? But it is also simultaneously really dangerous because there was a clear point to this. And I think while it's early, it looks to me like potentially a watershed moment, I think, for American democracy, because what Trump and Hegseth were signalling is the total removal of all morality from American defense forces and the American military, and simultaneously really turning the military into an instrument of the Oval Office against the American people. So one of the things that really stood out to me in Trump's speech was the way he said that, and he specifically identified Chicago and American cities could be used as training grounds for the American military. And so that's a kind of long way of saying that, what they are arguing is that morality is gone, that the US military can do whatever it wants and there will be no consequences, and that it can do whatever it wants on the streets of American cities with no consequences, including retaliation. And that is a real step change in the role of the military in the United States. And I think it is probably one of the most worrying evolutions of Project 2025, which I've written a little bit about, which was a conservative plan, the far-right plan for a second Trump administration, because this is all in there, really having the president be able to use the military as, his own, at his own personal directive. So this is, for me, really quite frightening because it is really normalising and legitimising that deep fascist tendency in American history that Trump has ridden to power.
So you think this is a rah-rah not for some external military action, God forbid Greenland or whatever it is. This is about what we're seeing in American cities, most recently, I think, Portland, with the National Guard sent out on the street. We also saw James Comey, the former FBI director under the second Obama administration, but of the first Trump administration, indicted. What does this say about the strength or the state of American democracy at this moment?
I would say it's difficult to be optimistic about American democracy at the moment, Glenn, given the things you've just mentioned, Trump going after his political enemies, like James Comey, executive orders coming out of the White House, describing people even like James Comey as the radical left, that is going to be crushed by this administration as it is deploying the National Guard into the streets of Portland, as it is using the Supreme Court to potentially gut key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. I think we have to, it's really difficult, but zooming out and seeing all of those things in context as part of a carefully thought through plan, really, to dismantle American democracy, to dismantle constitutional protections, to go back to your earlier question, what Hegseth and Trump are suggesting is deeply unconstitutional. Using the American military against the American people is unconstitutional. And, clearly they don't care about that. But that has potentially severe consequences for American democracy, which, of course, as we've discussed before, has flow-on effects for the rest of the world. So it is a really grim picture. Nothing in that sense is inevitable, but the lack of concerted resistance to what is happening, the lack of resistance that we are seeing from the military, for example, to what Hegseth is attempting to do, I think doesn't bode well for the immediate future, at least of American democracy.